All right, the next thing that I'm going to talk about, continuing with unit on psychopathology, let's talk about students with special needs in middle childhood. One area, depending on your own school experiences, one area you may be familiar with is that some children have special classes or special services based on their IQ scores. All right, very high or lower IQ scores. So we got to talk about IQ a little bit. We have to talk about how we measure intelligence. This is going to be a sort of basic shortened version compared to what you might get in an upper level class or a class on tests and measurements. All right, this is for a class where you just need to know what these things are. So first of all, we have to talk about the difference between aptitude and achievement. There are various tests that might be given to school children to try to figure out if they need special services, and a pretty common type are aptitude versus achievement. And an achievement test, I'm going to start with achievement. You probably, if you're in the United States, especially if you went to public school, you probably had achievement tests at some point, because those standardized tests that they give at certain years and they make a big deal out of them, they are often achievement tests. Achievement tests are measures of learning. They are supposed to be measures of actual learning. So this is a measure of mastery or proficiency in key subjects like reading, mathematics, writing, science, or some other subject. So, in my time, in my area, taking the LEAP test, and they test you on those subjects, that's supposed to be an achievement test. We also, sometimes not everybody has taken these tests, but you might have also at some point taken something that's an IQ test or something similar, and that is supposed to be a measure of aptitude. Aptitude is supposed to be like your potential for learning, the potential to master a specific skill or to learn a certain body of knowledge. So it can be influenced by your learning, but it's not supposed to be a measure of actual learning. It's supposed to be a measure of your potential, your knack for mastering a certain skill. It is supposed to predict who is going to need extra assistance in school or might need special classes. And IQ stands for intelligence quotient, and this was developed, way back late 1800s. The first intelligence quotient was calculated separately than they do it today, where it was supposed to be your chronological age, your actual age, the number of years you've been on the earth, was divided by your mental age, and then multiplied by 100. Actually, did I do that backwards? Now I'm trying to remember. Which one. So if your mental age is, mental age over chronological age times 100, and you get a number. All right, the numbers are computed differently, but one thing that we have maintained is that we try to keep it so that if you get a score of 100, you're average. Because if you think about it, mental age over chronological age, if you are 8 years old and you function at an 8-year-old level, that would be 8 divided by 8. That would be 1. 1 times 100 would be 100. You're average. Yay, you're average. Congratulations. By the way, it's not a bad thing to be average. Most people are average. So that would be average. So the computation is more complicated, but it's still based on norms, and we try to keep 100 average. Another issue with keeping 100 average is that people have changed over time in how they perform on IQ tests. One thing we have seen is that people's IQ scores will creep up over time. So every once in a while, we have to redo our norms. We have to look at, what does an average person get? What kind of functioning do you see with an average person? We have to adjust our norms because of something called the Flynn Effect. With the Flynn Effect, that means IQ scores have gradually been rising with different generations. So like the performance you have to show now to be average is actually different than what you would have had to have shown a few generations ago. But the idea is it's meant to be that 100 is average. So do you have to get exactly 100 to be average? No, there's actually this thing called a standard deviation, and this is a statistics and mathematical term. It means you can vary about the mean or the average by a certain degree, and you're still considered average. For IQ tests, for most IQ tests, the standard deviation is set at 15. So the idea is you can be 15 points above the average or 15 points below, and you're still considered average. So technically, it's between 85 and 115 is considered average. And most people are in that range. 68% of the people who are tested are in that range. So those are the average people. What if you get a little bit higher? You can be a standard deviation below or a standard deviation above. Typically, if you're one standard deviation above or below, typically you don't get extra services or anything other than them documenting, hey, they are, slightly atypical, but most people fall within that range. And so that would be, now I gotta do my math in my head again. All right, so the people who are between, is it 70? Did I do it right? Yes, 70, gosh. When you don't do it for a while, it gets a little rusty. 70 and 130, or actually 129, right? But in that range, it's like 98% of people are in that range. The vast majority of your people are within 2 standard deviations of the mean, the average. All right, so what about people who aren't? What about people who are 2 standard deviations different? Well, if you are above the mean, if you are 2 standard deviations above the mean and you have a 130 or higher IQ, you may qualify as gifted and talented, usually gifted. Gifted is the category that they use for IQ. Talented, in many cases, if they have a gifted and talented program at a school, talented will involve auditions and things like that. At my children's school, for the talented in the visual arts program, they have to submit something like a portfolio, a small portfolio because it's elementary school. But you have to exhibit your talent. But the gifted part, for gifted classes, it's pretty much it's pretty standard that a 130 IQ is the cutoff. You might be able to submit some other stuff, but that's that's your pretty common part aspect of the criteria. So if you are gifted and talented, you are high IQ, or unusually talented, or unusually creative, and you may require special education. And some people say, well, why do we care about them? They're gifted, they're talented, they're going to be fine. Well, the thing is, for those students, regular classes that are designed for average children, it's not bad to be average. Most people are average. The classes are designed for you. For those that are outside of that average range, the classes can either be frustrating, they could be boring, or they could just not address the stuff that you're skilled in, that you're talented in, or that you're interested in. And so sometimes students who qualify for gifted but don't get to go to gifted classes, sometimes they do things that don't seem to make sense, like fail their classes. They're like, well, why are they failing? They're brilliant. They're like, because I can't stand their classes, or they don't feel motivated. It's not, they're not in the zone of proximal development, to use a Vygotsky term. All right, so for my classes, I just want you to know your general definition of gifted. Now, what if your IQ is below the mean? All right, so if you are below an IQ of 70, you may qualify for the label of having an intellectual disability. Now, I say may because they also look at things like functioning. Do you have impaired daily functioning? Can you do the things that someone of your age is expected to do independently? Sometimes a person might have a lower IQ but not get that label because their functioning is higher, and sometimes people might not quite have the low enough IQ, but their functioning is lower. And so it's IQ and functioning that are considered for an intellectual disability diagnosis or labeling. Now, very importantly, sometimes students are like, wait, isn't that called something else? All right, we changed the name. We changed the label because what we were using for a long time was inaccurate, misleading. We used to call it mental retardation. Now, 2 major issues with that. All right, sometimes students are like, oh, because people were making fun of people calling them the R word. which is not tolerated in my classes, by the way. So people, they used it as a slur, they used it as an insult. So now they changed it, and so now people are just going to use intellectual disability as an insult. Well, yeah, one issue was that people took that word and they were using it as an insult, but that's not the main issue. The main issue is that the word didn't make sense given what we know about existing with intellectual disability. Retardation means being slowed down. If you had mental retardation, that means you were slowed in your development. Well, it's not that you have slow development. It's not like you can catch up or you're just behind. It's you have different development. All right. So it was misleading to use that term, and that's why they moved away from it. All right. There are more things I can say about intellectual disability, and I do go over some additional things from my upper level classes. For the class that this video is being posted for, I just want you to know, general definition of intellectual disability. All right, future videos, I'm going to talk about some other types of labels that can be applied to students with special needs. These are the ones having to do with IQ testing.